I think I have a few more minutes to tell you about literallity, which is the other part that I was telling you about before. So typically, this planum temporale language area is bigger than on the right than on the left than on the right in the majority of us. Okay. This is a diagram of this picture of the brain. In dyslexics, we tend to find this more often. Okay? So there's a disorder of laterality. Things are not shifting to the left in language areas the way they should. Is that a second hit? Is that a second vulnerability that makes their language areas a little bit odd and maybe more vulnerable? We did that study with the real brains many, many years ago, but since then there have been studies done with MRIs showing that there is an alteration in brain asymmetry in the language areas, in one language area, in dyslexics, demonstrated by MRIs. And it's very striking in males, again, compared to females. Again, we're seeing these differences in susceptibility between males and females. One in a neural migration anomaly I showed you before, and changes in the thalamus, and the other one here in the rate of unusual asymmetry manifestations in dyslexic males. What causes this abnormality of asymmetry? Have we learned anything new that helps us explain why the dyslexic brain might be altered in this manifestation of asymmetry? Could it be all learned? They just don't learn to force their left hemisphere to do their language stuff. And, it can't be all learned, because if we look at, for instance, fetal brains at 24, 27 weeks of gestation, there are asymmetries present there already. So this is something that, at least in part, is hardwired. You don't learn to be asymmetrical, at least not 100%. You have some structural predisposition present way early during development that makes you symmetrical or not asymmetrical. But we also know that you can tweak it behaviorally. So this is the work of Fisher-Landau and her husband, Standouan, in France, showing that even though you can be anatomical asymmetrical at birth, you're not necessarily very functionally asymmetrical unless you learn to read. And learning to read makes you more asymmetrical functionally. And here, for instance, with comparing functional asymmetry measured by activation of the left versus the right side of the brain, and someone who is a reader and someone who's not a reader, and as you learn to read, you change the activation toward the left. You make this structural asymmetry functionally explicit. You're there waiting to become functional to the left, but you need to learn to read to make it. And in fact, people who are illiterate have much more language representation on the right than people who are not illiterate. And we've known that for a long time, because we know that illiterate people that had strokes on the left side didn't become aphasics nearly as much as people who were literate, because they could compensate from the right side. They had not been moved over to the left as much. So there's there's a nature component and there's a nurture component. Back to the knockout. Now, if we delete genes for the DYX1C1, I showed you before a deleted gene in the DCDC2. In this case, we have to take out actually 3 exons to make this gene quiet and not do its job. Before you just took out 1 exon, now you need to take out 3. The same idea, we silence this gene, it doesn't work anymore. And what do we find? An amazing finding. Where is the milk? We find that half of the animals, when you feed them, when they feed from the mother, have the milk on the right side, and half of them have the milk on the left side. What does that mean? The stomach is on one side in one, and it's on the other side on the other. That's called Situs inversus. Normally we have the stomach on the left side. This animal has the stomach on the right side. 50% of the animals have Situs inversus. Laterality has not develop properly in this animal with a deletion in one of the dyslexia genes. Totally unexpected finding. But it begins to link dyslexia genes to changes in laterality. We now know that this happens because of something called a ciliopathy, which is a case where the cilia in certain parts of the embryo that are determining this laterality, they do it in a very wonderful way, really. Here are the cilia in a part called the node of the embryo, very young embryo, moving in a particular way. It has these little hairs have a motor that make them move, and moves in only in one direction, like this. And they pump molecules from one side of the midline to the other, so the concentration of molecules here is different from the concentration of molecules here. And this causes different genes to be expressed on this side compared to this side, and here you make a liver, and here you make a stomach, okay? If you stop the function of these, then it's random. There's going to be an asymmetry in molecular distribution anyway, but it's going to be totally random. There's nothing moving it in a particular direction. Some are going to be in the middle, some a little more here, some a little more there. And then there, you have situs inversus. You have 50% here and 50% there. We think that's what's happening in the brain in dyslexics. You have right-handed dyslexics and left-handed dyslexics, but they may not be the same kind because they are random. They don't have that particular motor, so they have an abnormal organization of the language area between the left and the right to begin with. Now, if on top of that, they don't learn to read, or they don't read as much, or they read slowly, therefore don't read as much, or they hate reading, therefore they don't read as much, then whatever functionally, whatever structural asymmetry they might have, it's not brought to its maximum capacity, and they get an aberrant language lateralization, which is another risk factor, I think, for dyslexia. Maybe you need both. Maybe if you have just one, the change in lateralization, or the other one, the noisy neurons, you don't get to be dyslexic unless you're learning to speak English or something. But the Italian ones get away with it. But if you have both, maybe that makes things a lot harder for these children. And I think I'm going to skip the summary slides because I've been summarizing as I went along, and it's already 10 o'clock, and maybe there's time for a few questions. Thank you very much.